Hello, I'm David Morris. We all remember where we were on September 11th, 2001, what the Americans call 9/11. It was a horrific moment when we all watched and recognised the horror of what was happening as thousands of people, innocent people, lost their lives in an unprovoked terrorist attack. And I think this was a moment that really set the tone for our 21st century. A few days later, I think it was, I was driving through the countryside in Tasmania, my home state where I was working, and I was listening on the radio to President Bush speaking about the horror of the 9/11 attacks and how the United States would respond. And he talked about the world either being with us or against us. And I must admit, like I think many people listening and thinking about the horror of that event, I had tears in my eyes as I sympathised. But at the same time, I think like many others as well, I had a fear that America was going to overreact and was going to seek some kind of revenge. And sure enough, I think that's sadly what happened, and it's all too common in human history. This is not only an American phenomenon, it's perhaps a human phenomenon. But I think it is important for us to reflect upon how the United States responded to 9/11, because it did set the tone for later events, I think, leading up to even today. The United States set out on a course of action in the Middle East. I found myself in Washington exactly 1 year after 9/11, so I had a direct experience of talking to decision makers. I had the great fortune of being chosen by the United States government, by the State Department, to have a month travelling across the United States and to absorb myself in American politics, American government, to meet lots of decision makers, lots of influencers, consultants and others. That's part of the State Department's soft power program called the International Visitor Leadership Program. So I was the Australian grantee in 2002, a long time ago now. But I had this amazing experience of spending a week in Washington during that visit and listening to the congressional debates about whether to go to war in Iraq. I had visits to Senator Clinton's office, Senator Lieberman's office, to many others in Washington, and had a chance to sit down and talk to all kinds of people with all kinds of views from across the political spectrum. And the thing that really struck me back then in 2002 was that there was a developing consensus. So regardless of whether someone was Republican or Democrat, there was a developing consensus that America at that point in its history had a unique leadership role in the world. So Americans, it seemed to me, were absolutely convinced of their mission to lead the world, and they wanted, what I heard in the voices of experts and decision makers, was they wanted to show the world who was boss. That was the reaction. Probably a perfectly natural human reaction to the horror of what had happened on 9/11. But I think it's important for us to understand the American mentality of believing that they must rule the world, believing that they are a force for good. And so people that later we described as neoconservatives, people who later we blamed for the excesses and the extreme actions that the United States took in the Middle East, war crimes and other things that many of us criticised America for. I think we ought to be careful to just blame some on one side of the political spectrum, or some to call people neoconservatives or whatever. My sense from that visit that I had, and the unique opportunity I had to talk to decision makers right across the spectrum, was that I think there was a consensus about America needs to show the world who is boss. And I sympathise with it. I'm not criticising it, I'm just pointing out that I think that mentality then later explains to us how perhaps the United States, after the global financial crisis, after its economy nearly collapsing and essentially being held together by its interdependence with China, and China holding on to huge amounts of American debt and continuing to be a major market for the United States, and then Americans noticing that, hey, China has become the second biggest economy in the world, a competitor to the United States. I think understanding the American experience of the last couple of decades, the international experience, helps to explain to us why America feels under threat and why it is not comfortable with having a peer competitor, an equal in the world. It understands itself as wanting to lead the world. So it brings us to the risk, the threat of a new Cold War. And I'll have more to say about that next time.